Start with a program that asks the user how big of a square they want to see. So in other words, if the square is going to be 4 sides, then we'll have something like this. Maybe we'll have asterisks that represent, the number of rows and the number of columns. So we'll call these guys over here rows. Let me just copy and paste this. And let's see if I can drag this over here. So take these two over here, copy and paste. And let's see if I can drag over here like this. Good. So these guys over here we'll call rows. And these guys over here we'll call columns. And by the user entering the number 4, this is what we're going to draw. 4 rows and 4 columns. If they enter 3, then it would just be, like these 9 right here, and so forth and so on. It'll grow or shrink based on the user input. Okay, so let's think about what it is that we're going to need. You're definitely going to need to know what the user number is, right? So should I create that as a double? No.
No, you want that as an integer.
Integer, very good. So we'll say user num will be an integer, and that's going to represent the number of sides, or the side value, right? So we'll say the side value. Now, whenever you see a pattern, such as the growth of numbers, or a pattern like a triangle or a square or an octagon, whatever it is, you've got to think repetition structure. That's how you're going to be able to draw this thing. So we're going to draw a certain number of rows, and each of those rows has a column. So we'll say columns and also rows. And that'll be my counter, the number of rows, the number of columns, right? That's what we want to be able to display all the way up to.
Now, these not necessarily going to be squares. We're picking the number of rows and columns, or we're just.
So we want to be able to display a square like this.
You want a square.
So when the user gives us 4, then we know that columns has to be set to 4, rows has to be set to 4.
Oh, I thought we were doing.
We'll just do this right here, like I've drawn over here, a square.
Oh.
So then we'll go over here to get user input, and we'll say cout, enter a side value for a square. And we'll obtain that value and put that into user num. Okay, so now that I have that value, let's make it so that we are going to be incrementing every single iteration. So we'll have a loop inside of a loop that draws all of the columns and draws all of the rows. So we can use a for statement for that. So we'll say for, let's let all the columns will start equal to 0, say for example. We'll assign this to 0, and then as long as the column is less than the user number, and then columns plus plus. So what this guy does is it's going to be responsible for drawing all the columns. Now we also want to draw all of the rows inside of that given column. Okay, so let's think about this first before I continue. Now, if we're drawing a console program, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can send this to an output variable string, or we can just use cout and send it to the console. Now, if we're sending it to the console, we've got to be careful here because it looks like I'll need to draw this star first, then this one, and so forth and so on. I won't be able to draw this star, then this one, and then go back to the top if I'm using cout. Can everyone see that? Right. So I have to draw this first row, then I have to draw the second row, and so forth and so on. If that's the case, then it looks like for row 1, draw columns 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So which approach shall we take? Maybe we'll do both approaches. Okay. So let's just take the cout approach, where we're going to draw this first row. Well, if that's the case, then I better go back over here and do a correction here, because it looks like I'm drawing all the columns and maybe I should do for every single row, and I'll just copy and paste this over here and over here. For every single row, draw column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then go to the next row to draw all those columns, and then on to the next row, and so forth and so on. So over here, we'll have another statement. So for all of these columns, we'll set that equal to 0 as well. And as long as this is less than the user number, and then we'll increment the number of columns. So I have one loop nested inside of another loop, but you can see that what we're saying is for row 0, which will be this guy right here. Let's say that this is row 0. Draw column 0, draw column 1, draw column 2, draw column 3. Okay, we've just drawn all of the stars for that particular row. You are now ready for the next row. So this is the behavior. It'll go like this, and then it'll draw all of the columns, and then it'll go back out, and then draw all of the columns, go back out, draw all the columns for that row, so forth and so on. Yeah?
Shouldn't be less than and equal.
Less than, okay, good question. Let's see what happens. So if I start off equal to 0, now how many rows do I have? How many columns do I have? Yeah, I know. You know the answer. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the user entered 4. If this were equal, that would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is 5. And we don't want 5. So that's why I deliberately do that. You know what? Computer scientists, we love to start things off at 0. So that's why I love to bring up the analogy of racing slot cars. When you race slot cars, when I race slot cars with my son, I'll say, okay, set the track counter, and he sets it to 0. And then ready, set, go. When we finish our first lap, it goes from 0 to 1. And so forth and so on.
Now, why did you just change your approach from your first for statement, your outer for statement being columns to rows?
Because when I send output to the screen, when I use the cout statement, I can't see out this column and then go back to the top. Cout won't allow me to go back to the top. So I have to draw the first row with the cout statement. Then I'll use an endl statement to go to the beginning of the next line, and then I can go from there. Now, if I'm using a string called output, then maybe I could draw all of the columns first. But so that's why I switched them around. Okay, so at this point then, we need to display an asterisk. So we'll say cout, whatever an asterisk, say for example, and now, when we've done that, it's going to go back over here. Columns is going to increment by 1. Is that number less than the user number? If it is, draw another star to the output, and so forth and so on. So this thing is going to continue to draw stars to the output. Here, 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 as long as it is less than the user number. Once it is no longer user or less than the user number, this is finished. And so then what we want to do is, we're over here, we want to go to the beginning of the next line. So over here we'll say cout endl to go to the beginning of the next line. So now the cursor is blinking over here, waiting to be, to have something drawn in that particular location. So we go back to the for statement for rows. Row 0 now becomes row 1. So 1, is that less than the user number? Yes, it is. So now look at what happens in this for statement. Columns gets reassigned to 0. So with this 0, is that less than the user number? Yes, it is. So it draws this first star. And then columns is going to be incremented. Is that less than the user number? Yes. So we draw from here to here to here all the way to the end. Yes?
How does columns get stacked to 0? Get that.
Here, at the very beginning. When you execute this for statement, columns is set to 0.
Once, though.
You did. When we first entered this for statement, columns was set to 0. But then what happens is, when we go back to the top and re-execute this, you now visit the for statement for a second time. And so what happens is column gets incremented, and absolutely, yeah, it gets incremented after it gets reestablished to 0. So now that this for statement is finished, and now that we've gone to the beginning of the next line, it looks like we may be done. Let's see what happens. So let me save my work and run the program. and let me enter 5. Okay,
Yeah, you forgot to put returns, what do you call
Stop
it,
the
system
program.
pause.
forgot to do that. Yep, system pause, turn 0. There we go. And we'll try it again. So I enter 5. So let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. That's good. Let's try another number. So I'll try 3. 3 rows, 3 columns.
Do you think we should put a space between the panels and the or it might just be on my
No, you're right. It does look weird. It depends on the font. For example, if I go back over here, if I'm using a monospaced font, it'll look a little bit more organized. But in this case, it looks like, let's see
Oh, I
here.
didn't know you had properties on this thing too.
That doesn't look very good. Let's see.
I think it looks perfect.
That looks horrible. Let's see here. Let's try 10, 20. Yeah, that's not looking good. I really messed things up. It has to do with the output and how what font it's using to display it. So yeah, if you wanted to put a space in between, that might help. Yeah, to make it look more like a square.
How did you look at properties?
When you run a program, if you right-click on a window, it'll give you the properties, and then from there you can display all the different stuff that you want to look at.
All right.
All right.